Hello, economic students. Yesterday we talked about some of the controversies surrounding corporations. And one of those controversies that we discuss is whether or not some corporations have gotten too big. These corporations are huge and powerful in some instances. And so I want to talk today about that particular issue. And there's a term that you might sometimes hear related to these really huge corporations, and that term is too big to fail. In other words, are there some corporations that are so big and so powerful and so vital to our nation's economy that we cannot allow them to fail, to go out of business, that they are too big to fail? So let's get started with this very important topic, and let's start with a little bit of background as to why this has become a serious controversy and a serious issue. First of all, back in 2008, several of the largest banks and manufacturing companies in the United States were about to fall into bankruptcy as the nation fell into the worst recession that we had had since the Great Depression of the 1930s. The recession of 2008-2009 was extremely painful, and lots of large important companies were teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, including some of the largest banks in the United States and some of the other largest manufacturing companies in the United States that employ thousands and thousands of people. So the government stepped in, and the United States government provided $700 million in low-interest loans to the 8 largest banks in the country, and some of that money also went to General Motors and a few other very large manufacturing corporations. $700 million in 2008 was a big chunk of change. These loans, by the way, were not available to the vast majority of businesses in the USA. They were only made available to a very small handful of some of the most powerful companies in the world. So, here's the issue, and I want to make sure that you understand this. You may want to get this in some notes. Are some corporations too big to fail and therefore entitled to be saved by the government if they get into financial trouble? And I want to give you some arguments for this, and arguments for the loans, arguments for the idea that some companies are too big to fail. First of all, if some of these huge corporations were to go bankrupt, the damage to the economy would be so bad that the country could fall into a terrible depression, something equally as bad as what happened in the 1930s with the Great Depression, or in 2008, the fear was that it could be even worse than the Great Depression. The cost of such a depression in unemployment compensation and lower economic output would be very high and very long lasting. It would take a long time for the country to pull itself out of that kind of a depression where the very largest corporations in America cease to be able to do business. And then the idea is that the cost of saving these companies from bankruptcy would be actually less than the cost of letting them go out of business. As we've already seen, if some of these very large companies went out of business, there would be a huge cost in unemployment compensation that the government would have to give to keep its, the people that used to work there. You don't want them to starve and lose their homes, so we have to give them unemployment compensation during the period of time while they're looking for new work, which would be hard to find in a terrible depression. Additionally, the cost in the lower output of the United States of America's businesses would be extremely high as well. Our economy could potentially shrink in a very large way. So those are some arguments for the loans and why the idea was that these companies were too big to allow them to fail. But there are also some arguments against these loans. Every single corporation has a risk for failure. Stockholders, when you buy stock, you assume that risk when you buy the stock. Okay, when you buy stock that there is a risk that this company could go out of business. That is a part of the cost of buying stock that every stockholder is aware of. There is risk involved. By saving the failing corporation, however, that is, by saving the corporation with money from the government, that risk is shifted from stockholders to the taxpayers. And in shifting risk to the taxpayers, the taxpayers did not voluntarily buy the stock. Stockholders did, taxpayers did not, so why should the taxpayer assume that risk? Taxpayers do not profit from the stock, so they should not be subject to losses if the company fails. Losses if a company fails should only be applied to the stockholders, the people who own the company, not to regular taxpayers who cannot benefit from that company's profitability at all. So why should they be harmed by that company's failure to be able to be profitable? And there's something called moral hazard, and this is an important concept, and I want to make sure that you get this, that you know what moral hazard is. Moral hazard is the idea that corporations will assume unwise risks if they know that the government will not allow them to fail. Okay, then we call that moral hazard. Society, according to the argument, should not provide an incentive for this moral hazard. Again, it's a moral hazard because if companies don't have the fear of failure, they will do unwise things. They will take unwise risks. And, there is a moral issue to that. And then in taking these unwise risks, they know that their own stockholders aren't going to pay the price. The United States will pay the price, the United States taxpayers. And is that fair? Most people would say it is not. You didn't buy that stock. Why should you take the cost if the company fails? So, a couple more arguments about against this idea of a company being too big to fail. Only the largest corporations will be saved by the government if they get into financial trouble. Only a few are too big to fail. Is that fair to smaller corporations? Most people would say no. Why should the government step in and protect a huge corporation like General Motors or like Bank of America when that same generosity of the government would not be applied to a smaller company, and not even that small a company? The United States government is not going to step in and say, for example, Woodward Governor in Rockford, Illinois, it is not too big to fail. The United States government did not step in to try to save, say, Midland Bank, which does business in Rockford, but they would stop in and save a company like Bank of America or JP Morgan Chase. These are huge banks that are like, many times larger than some of the banks that you see here in Rockford, Illinois. Why don't they get to have the same kind of generosity from the government as the huge banks do? And then by saving a failing company, the government is preventing more efficient or more wisely managed companies from taking the place of the failed corporation. If there's a company, let's say General Motors, I don't mean to denigrate GM, but let's say General Motors is not making money, and that they were to go bankrupt. General Motors is a huge automobile manufacturing company. Well, if General Motors goes bankrupt, what's going to happen? Will people stop buying cars? Of course not. People will still buy cars, and there will still be plenty of companies out there that are making good cars and that are making cars in a profitable way. Do you want to really save a company that is inefficient and unable to produce cars in a profitable way, or should we start directing our money to a company that can make better cars more efficiently, and therefore, we benefit still? If the factories that produce the General Motors cars went bankrupt and stopped operating, chances are a profitable company would buy those factories and maybe not employ as many people as GM did, but still employ people to keep making something out of those factories. So that's a strong argument there. When you save a failing company, you're really devoting resources to companies that are inefficient, not profitable, not necessarily managed in a wise way, and punishing indirectly companies that are more efficient and are better managed companies. So those are arguments against this idea of too big to fail. Now, this is the end of this presentation. Tomorrow we're going to look at another one of those controversies, which is who do companies have responsibilities towards? Is it only to the stockholders, or is it to people other than stockholders, such as the community at large where the corporation does business and its own employees? So that's for tomorrow, and with this we're going to close this presentation. As always, check Canvas to see whether or not there is an assignment for you. You guys have a great day.